Caribbean cooks landed in 1950s, Britain carrying memories of warm kitchens, then rebuilt them dish by dish in a cold, unfamiliar place. 1. Rice and peas, Jamaica plus wider Caribbean. Rice and peas landed on British shores with the early Caribbean immigrants. Long before specialist shops were common, they learned to improvise. The version most often cooked used red kidney beans, easier to find in Britain than pigeon peas, or gungo peas, as some in Jamaica call them. Cooking this dish was simple: rice, beans, water, sometimes a splash of coconut milk, a sprig of thyme, a clove of garlic or onion if available, simmered until the rice soaked up the flavors. It didn't need much. A one-pot meal, filling and warm. For many immigrants, Sunday meant getting that pot on. After a week of cold weather and often tight budgets, the warm bowl of rice and peas was more than food. It was a thread linking them to home, the smells and tastes they remembered before crossing the Atlantic. Over time, as more Caribbean families settled and more shops began stocking beans, rice, spices, that dish held its place. It was a constant, familiar, grounding, a small ritual that helped anchor a sense of belonging amid the fog and grey skies. Even when ingredients were scarce or different from back home, this dish offered comfort. Simple, nourishing, and ready whenever it was needed. 2. Fried dumplings, Johnny cakes, Jamaica, Barbados, Bahamas. What do you cook when money's tight, the weather's miserable, and you still want something that feels like home on the plate? For a lot of Caribbean families in 1950s, Britain, the answer was fried dumplings, or what many from Barbados and the Bahamas would call Johnny cakes. They needed little more than flour, a bit of fat, a pinch of baking powder, maybe a touch of sugar and salt. Rationing had officially ended by the mid-50s, but habits from the ration years lingered, and plain flour stayed one of the most dependable things on the shelf. These dumplings had a job: stretch whatever else was in the pot. If there was saltfish, a bit of tinned corned beef, leftover stew, even just a cup of tea, a few rounds of dough in hot oil turned it into a meal. You could feed several people from a single bowl of dough, which mattered in cramped houses where wages were low and there were often extra relatives or lodgers staying over. Children learned quickly that if they were sent to the kitchen to make up some dumpling, it meant there wasn't much else, but nobody was going hungry. There was also the question of timing. Fried dumplings were quick, no slow simmer, no waiting for a big pot to finish. People working long shifts, bus conductors, factory workers, hospital staff, could come home, heat some fat in a shallow pan, and have something ready within minutes. They could be eaten hot or left on a plate to be grabbed cold on the way out the door, tucked into a pocket or wrapped in paper. One pointed detail here is how they quietly replaced British staples. Many Caribbean migrants found sliced white bread too soft and bland, and bakery loaves didn't keep well in damp rooms. A batch of dumplings cost less, held together better, and felt closer to what they were used to back home, even if the flour came from a shop on a grey high street rather than a village store. 3. Hard dough bread, Jamaica. By the time Caribbean bakeries started opening in parts of London and Birmingham, hard dough bread was already treated almost like its own category of food. People would travel past several British bakeries selling soft-sliced loaves and queue, instead for this solid, slightly sweet brick of bread that could actually hold a filling without falling apart. It turned into the base for packed lunches, late-night snacks after shifts, and school sandwiches piled with cheese, margarine, or tinned fish. Among working-class migrants sharing rooms and paying high rents, that loaf signaled something different from the pale, airy bread found in most British shops. It looked like it belonged to them, even though the flour and yeast came from the same mills everyone else used. That outcome grew from a simple rejection of the bread that was first offered. Early arrivals tried British loaves and found them too light, too quick to go stale, and useless under heavy fillings like corned beef or fried plantain. So people started making their own versions at home, using strong white flour, sugar, fat, and longer kneading to get the tight crumb they were used to in Jamaica. Once there was a clear demand, small Caribbean bakeries stepped in, turning what had been a home workaround into a daily purchase that marked out Caribbean streets and shops. It raises a small question that never quite goes away. How did something as ordinary as bread become one of the clearest ways to tell who a neighborhood was really feeding? Okra goes in first. Spinach follows in tight handfuls. In late 1940s and 1950s Britain, that's what callaloo often looked like in Caribbean kitchens, a deep green stew built from whatever leafy veg a local greengrocer in Brixton, Handsworth or Moss Side actually had. Back in Trinidad, Dominica, or parts of Jamaica, the dish usually depended on dasheen bush or other taro and xanthosoma leaves, boiled down with okra, coconut milk, pumpkin, crab, or salted meat. Those leaves didn't arrive with the first big post-war migrants on the Empire Windrush in 1948, and they certainly didn't show up in ordinary 1950s British high streets where the choice was more likely to be cabbage, sprouts, beetroot, and a small stack of seasonal greens. Spinach, on the other hand, slotted neatly into Ministry of Food advice and wartime-era ideas about good vegetables, so it filtered back into shops as imports and homegrown supplies stabilized in the early 50s. So Caribbean home cooks did the practical thing. They took bunches of British spinach, sliced it down, and treated it the way they would have treated dasheen bush or callaloo bush, into the pot with okra, onion, thyme, maybe coconut milk from a tin when that became easier to find, cooked until it turned into a thick dark sauce to spoon over rice or root vegetables. By the later 1950s and into the 1960s, some families started claiming neglected allotments in cities like Nottingham, clearing old beds so they could grow callaloo, pumpkin, and other Caribbean crops alongside the spinach they were already used to. Official descriptions of British diets from that era rarely mention those plots, but for the people using them, they were a way to get closer to the original leaves that had given the dish its name. That brings things back to the pan, where okra goes in first and spinach still follows. Decades later, tins labeled callaloo on British shelves usually hold a smooth, dark green blend cooked from spinach or similar greens with okra and seasonings, echoing those early substitutions more than the wild leaves people on the Windrush ships had grown up eating. 5. Saltfish and ackee, Jamaica. A small detail sits on the label. Ackee's in brine, product of Jamaica. That line traces a whole route from a factory yard near Kingston to a cramped kitchen in Birmingham, where someone is rinsing salt off cod and waiting for the tin to open. By the mid to late 1950s, Jamaican plants were canning ackee specifically for export, loading metal drums and cartons onto ships bound for Europe and North America, even as the fruit itself remained too fragile and toxic to travel fresh. The tins landed at British ports, passed through importers who dealt in colonial groceries, then on to wholesalers who supplied a handful of specialist shops in areas like Brixton, Notting Hill, and parts of Manchester and Birmingham, where Caribbean migrants were clustering. Saltfish followed a different path in the opposite direction. Cheap preserved cod from Canada or Norway, already familiar in the Caribbean since the plantation era, now turning up in British shops and markets where West Indian customers knew exactly how to use it. It's slightly odd that a national dish built from two long-distance commodities could be so hard to assemble in the country that ruled both ends of the trade. Even when there was only one Caribbean grocer for miles around, people learnt which day the shipment came in, bought a tin or two of ackee, and tucked it carefully beside the packets of salt cod and the big bags of rice at the back of the cupboard. 6. Stewed chicken, across the Caribbean. By the end of the week, what many Caribbean families in 1950s Britain wanted on the table was a pot of stewed chicken, pieces of bird in a dark, glossy gravy, poured over rice or rice and peas until everything on the plate took on the same brown color. To get there, someone had usually started earlier in the day or the night before, seasoning whatever chicken they could afford with salt, black pepper, thyme, onion, maybe a bit of garlic and whatever spice mix they favored, then standing at the stove to burn sugar in oil until it turned from pale grains into a near-black syrup that would stain the meat as it browned. In some households, that sugar step used a bottle of commercial browning brought from home or bought from a specialist shop. In others, it stayed strictly homemade because supply was patchy and recipes varied from island to island, and even between neighbors on the same street, with some people insisting on long marinating times, and others throwing everything together after a shift if that was all the day allowed. What stayed consistent was how the dish functioned. It turned a single chicken, sometimes bulked out with extra back and neck pieces from accommodating butchers, into enough food to feed several people. It filled lunchboxes for work the next day, and it gave Sunday or payday a shape that felt familiar even when the address was a cold terrace house in Wolverhampton or Paddington. 7. Cornmeal porridge, Jamaica, Barbados, St. Lucia. What do you cook when there's barely any money left and everyone still has to get through a long, cold morning? Cornmeal porridge was one of the answers in a lot of Caribbean homes across 1950s Britain. A bag of cornmeal or maize meal from an ordinary British grocer cost less than boxed cereals, used less milk than oats if you stretched it with water, and could be flavored with whatever was around. A spoon of sugar, a bit of condensed milk, a scrape of nutmeg if someone had brought some over in a suitcase. In houses where several people were sharing rent and wages, a single pot could cover children getting ready for school, adults heading to factories, bus depots or hospitals, and whoever was working nights and needed something before bed. It looked like poor people's food to some British onlookers, thick and heavy compared to toast and marmalade. Yet inside those households, it sat right in line with how breakfast worked back in Jamaica, Barbados or St. Lucia, hot, filling, and based on grain rather than bread. Cornmeal porridge also carried a quiet contradiction about status. In the Caribbean, it had often been associated with rural life and working-class families, which matched how it sat in post-war Britain. The dish of people living in bedsits and terraced houses, making do on lower wages and shift work. At the same time, it showed up on Sunday mornings in homes where parents were pushing children toward education and betterment, served in mismatched bowls before they went off in neat uniforms to schools where their classmates talked about cornflakes and cocoa. Some of those children grew up learning both that this porridge was what you ate when things were tight, and that it was also the breakfast their parents chose even when there was just enough money for something more fashionable. 8. Oxtail stew, Jamaica plus wider Caribbean. The butcher is already halfway through the tail, cleaver coming down in steady chops. Small joints drop onto the paper. They're cheap. Sometimes they're almost an afterthought, offered out once the better cuts have gone. In 1950s Britain, many local customers saw oxtail as bony waste, so it was priced low, which made it perfect for Caribbean families who knew exactly how long you could cook those joints until the meat loosened and the bones gave up their gelatin into a thick stew that could sit on the stove for hours. From there, one tail could feed several people once it met carrots, onions, seasoning, and a heavy pot. Across cities where Caribbean migrants settled, that same pattern played out. Butchers in working-class districts selling oxtail for little money, Caribbean home cooks turning it into something that could stretch across Sunday dinner and Monday's lunch, and neighbors slowly realizing that the cut they'd ignored for years could, under different hands, become the center of a meal rather than a scrap from the back of the counter. 9. Curry goat, Jamaica, Trinidad. How do you make curry goat when there's no goat to buy? In 1950s Britain, Caribbean families asked for goat at ordinary butchers and were pointed toward mutton or old sheep instead. Goat wasn't part of mainstream British eating, so wholesalers barely bothered to bring it in, and the animals that were slaughtered often went into pet food or vanished into mixed stew cuts. So the dish traveled by name first. People marinated whatever they could get that was closest in flavor and toughness. Mutton neck, shoulder, scrag end. The same curry powders from home, the same slow cooking, the same weekend timing, but the meat itself had changed. Socially, the name didn't change with it. On Sunday, neighbors still said they were going by so-and-so for curry goat, even if everyone knew the butcher on the corner hadn't seen an actual goat in months. The title of the dish carried more cultural weight than the label on the carcass. By the early 1960s, as more Caribbean and later South Asian butchers opened, actual goat crept back into the pot, one tray at a time. But how many years did people keep calling it curry goat while quietly cooking mutton instead? 10. Escovitch fish, Jamaica. By the time the plate reached the table, it looked like any Sunday escovitch. The fish had been fried hard in shallow oil, left quite dry on the outside, so it could stand up to the onslaught of vinegar, sliced onions, carrot strips, and Scotch bonnet with the seeds mostly pulled out. Then everything was doused while the fillets were still warm, so the surface softened just enough without turning soggy under the sharp pickle that did most of the preserving work in a cold shared kitchen. What quietly changed in 1950s, Britain was the fish itself. Instead of fresh snapper or parrotfish, families leaned on whatever the fishmonger on a grey high street actually had. So mackerel, cod, and sometimes whiting took the scalding oil, and the timing had to be adjusted because cod flaked apart faster while mackerel needed a firmer fry to hold its shape under the vinegar. All of this done in light vegetable oil or blended frying fat, rather than the oils named in Caribbean cookbooks, which makes those later claims about unchanged traditional escovitch in exile sound neat on the page. But none of those tidy versions mention a battered aluminium pan spitting over a tiny rented stove. 11. Pepper pot, Guyana. The casserite bottle usually sat there all year, half used and sticky. It looked like something that could be thrown out with the old jars, yet everything about Christmas pepper pot depended on that one bottle being there, ready. Guyanese families in Britain guarded it carefully, because without casserite you didn't have pepper pot, you just had a plain meat stew. The sauce came from cassava juice boiled down with spices until it turned almost black, and that concentrate did two things at once. It colored the whole pot and helped keep the meat safe to eat for days. People would buy it from the handful of early Caribbean shops in places like London, or get relatives to pack a bottle in a suitcase from Georgetown. Meat changed with whatever the local butcher had, but the pot still went on the stove on Christmas Eve, still sat reheating through Boxing Day while people came and went from shift work or night buses. Leftovers from the British table might be cold and dull by the 27th, yet pepper pot kept going, deepening each time it was warmed through. How many of those old casserite bottles sat on shelves for years after people stopped making the dish? 12. Pone, cassava, or cornmeal, Barbados, Guyana. Grated cornmeal batter slid into small pans. Hands tamped it flat without much torque. That job used to belong to cassava back home. In Britain, the root hardly appeared in ordinary markets. Cornmeal, though, turned up in bulk bags behind counter doors. Shopkeepers serving Barbadian and Guyanese customers could actually reorder it, which raises a quiet question about why a whole root crop simply never followed them. So pone shifted almost by default. Spice, sugar, dried coconut, maybe a splash of condensed milk, went into the same mixing bowls that older relatives remembered using for grated cassava. And the finished slab still showed up at church socials and domino nights as the cheap cake people could stretch across a crowd. It carried a small social edge too. Rice puddings and steamed sponges belonged to canteens and school dinners, but a tray of cornmeal pone on a formica table marked out the house as Caribbean, even when everything else in the room had come from a British catalogue. Fresh cassava stayed mostly theoretical, talked about more than seen, while the pans in front of people filled with a version made from whatever grain the import system decided they were allowed to have. 13. Black cake, rum cake, across the Caribbean. Black cake was non-negotiable at Christmas. In the Caribbean, dried fruit went into rum months ahead. Bottles sat in dark corners. Sugar was added in handfuls. By December, the fruit and alcohol had merged into a kind of thick, boozy paste that folded straight into the batter, and the cake baked low and slow until it was almost black. That habit came with people to Britain, but the ingredients changed. Instead of market stalls and homemade rum, there were £1 bags of mixed dried fruit from British grocers, and whichever dark rum a relative could bring back or find behind a city bar. In a lot of homes, the calendar started in the same way. Jars pulled from the cupboard in early autumn, fruit tipped in, rum poured over, lid screwed tight. Children were sent to stir the bowl on baking day, then shooed away while adults poked the surface and decided if more alcohol was needed, and the finished cake went under foil on a sideboard to be fed with extra rum, while relatives booked time off and saved for travel. For all that effort, plenty of people quietly preferred the cheap light sponge that turned up from the local supermarket. 14. Sauce, Barbados, Trinidad. Lime juice went in first, over the boiled pig trotters and ears. Then came salt, sliced cucumber, pepper, onion, maybe a clove or two of garlic. Everything sat in a big bowl or basin while people got on with other jobs, and by the time they came back, the meat had taken on that sharp, clean tang that made it feel like a different cut entirely. In Barbados and Trinidad, sauce already belonged to weekend street life. Yet in Britain, it shifted slightly. West Indian cooks walked into local butchers and asked for feet, snouts, ribs and other cheap pieces, and the same working-class neighborhoods that watched them carry home those bundles were usually buying pork chops from the exact animal at a higher price. For many migrants, it turned into group food rather than a private meal. A big dish of sauce appeared next to bottles on a coffee table or on a shared kitchen counter in a hostel, everybody fishing out pieces with forks and trading gossip about landlords' buses, the latest rumor from home. Some families switched to making chicken sauce on certain days, keeping the same sour liquid and almost the same ritual. The name never changed, even when the meat did. 15. Macaroni pie, Barbados, Trinidad. Why did macaroni pie settle so easily into 1950s Britain? The method stayed almost identical from Bridgetown to Brixton. Boil elbow macaroni for about 10 minutes, drain it, then bury it in grated cheddar from those standard 1-pound blocks sold in 1950s and early 60s corner shops. Beat in eggs, canned evaporated milk, a little English mustard, salt and black pepper, then scrape the mixture into a greased enamel dish. In tiny bedsits in Ladbroke Grove or shared houses in Handsworth, it went into gas ovens at Mark IV, roughly 180 degrees, until the top set firm enough to cut in squares. The cheese itself came from British dairies in Somerset or Cheshire, produced on a scale that made mature cheddar cheaper than the tinned Caribbean goods migrants really wanted, which is why a Sunday tray in London could look almost exactly like one from Port of Spain. British families use the same cheddar mostly for sandwiches and toast, so how did a factory block of cheese travelling 2,000 miles end up feeling more Caribbean in Notting Hill than in half the suburbs around it? 16. Rundown, Jamaica. The coconut milk often came from a tin that had never seen the Caribbean. It sat on a British grocer's shelf beside custard powder and baked beans, then ended up in a pot called rundown. In Jamaica, the stew started with fresh coconut grated by hand, water squeezed through cloth, boiled down until the liquid thickened and the oil separated, then salted fish, onion and whatever cheap vegetables were around went in. In 1950s Britain, that slow, physical step got replaced by a can you could open with a key, which meant rundown could happen in a shared kitchen after a factory shift, without a yard, a grater or a coal stove. Official company recipes pushed coconut milk for neat curries and continental dishes. None of that explained how migrants actually used it. Rundown turned those tins into something closer to home. The stew was still cooked down until it clung to the fish and the edges of the pot, still eaten with yam or boiled dumplings when people could get them, or with bread when they couldn't. Shop records showed coconut milk sales climbing in areas with large Jamaican communities, yet British food writers described it as a novelty ingredient for entertaining, while the same cans kept turning up in weekday stews that never reached any cookbook. 17. Cow foot stew, Jamaica. A metal tray in a cold British shop held neat rows of cleaned cow feet. The butcher saw off joints, weighed them in 2s and 3s, and wrapped them in thin paper while the prime cuts went to other customers. For Caribbean families, that cheap bundle was the whole point, because it turned into something rich and filling at home. In Jamaican kitchens across London, Birmingham and Bristol, those feet were scrubbed again, then blanched, then simmered for hours with onion, thyme, pimento, and whatever seasoning cubes fit the week's budget. Gelatin thickened the pot as the connective tissue broke down, and the stew stretched with spinners or potatoes so one purchase from Saturday could feed people on Sunday and still reheat on Monday. The same cut that barely registered on the butcher's counter became the star ingredient once it left the shop. There was a quiet contradiction in how it was treated. In British cookery books of the 1950s and 60s, cow heel shows up as an occasional soup thickener, almost an afterthought, while in many Jamaican households that stew sat at the center of payday meals, bought from the same tray that most shoppers barely glanced at twice. 18. Pigtail stew, Trinidad, Jamaica. By the late 1950s, Britain was importing smoked pigtails specifically for Caribbean customers. The paperwork from wholesalers isn't always clear on who ordered what, or exactly when the first shipment started, but the direction of travel is obvious. Tails that British factories could have turned into animal feed were instead salted, smoked, boxed, and sent to a handful of inner-city shops. In Trinidadian and Jamaican homes, that decision showed up as pigtail stew at the end of the week, when money was tight, but people still expected a hot pot on the table. Families stretched a few bony pieces across rice, ground provision, or split peas, turning a specialized import into something that fed several people at once. The tails carried another job too. They signaled that a shop was for we, a place where you could hear your accent, get your seasoning, and pick up something that didn't appear in the main supermarket down the road. There's a pointed detail in that. The British state struggled to recognize West Indians as citizens, while British suppliers quietly recognized them as a market. How many pallets you had to move before anyone admitted that out loud is harder to pin down. 19. Fish tea, Jamaica. How do you make fish tea when there's no snapper, no Dr. Fish, nothing that looks like home? In 1950s, Britain, Jamaican cooks started at the fish counter, not the shoreline. The big trawler firms were landing plenty of haddock, cod and whiting, and the cheap end of that system was boxes of bony pieces and heads that restaurants didn't want. Those cartons moved quietly into West Indian groceries and takeaways, chopped into portions, boiled with yam or green banana, and sold as soup in small portions to customers coming off late shifts. It suited the wholesalers. They cleared low-value stock without changing their routes. Same lorries, same depots, just one more delivery line scribbled on a pad. You'd expect someone to advertise this niche, yet most of it ran through informal agreements between a few shopkeepers, a friendly salesman, and whatever space was left in the van that week. The names stayed the same, even when the only Caribbean thing in the pot was the seasoning. On the invoice, though, it sat under a different label. Cod trimmings, bulk pack. 20. Cassava bread, Yibami, Jamaica. Grated cassava is packed into a cloth and twisted hard. That motion shows up again and again in people's memories of early bami in 1950s Britain. Some remember blocks of frozen cassava arriving from Jamaica by the late 50s, wrapped in waxed cardboard, half thawed by the time they reached a small upstairs front room in London. Others insist it was the early 60s, long after those first stories. Either way, the work was the same. Grate, squeeze, press into small discs for the pan. Shop-bought bami sat at the other end of that effort. By the late 1950s, a few West Indian grocers stocked thin, factory-made rounds, priced higher than most people's homemade version. Some households treated those packets as a backup, something you bought when there wasn't time to grate and press a batch yourself. Others avoided them, saying the texture never matched what came from the cloth and pan. Those packets showed supply chains could bend around one migrant craving, yet the same customers still spent evenings grating and twisting for the bami they trusted. By 1960, some stalls in Brixton and Handsworth were selling both side by side. 21. Brown stew fish, Jamaica. Most of the cod used for brown stew fish arrived already filleted. It came in frozen slabs stacked in the backs of small wholesalers' vans. Those boxes then went straight to high street fishmongers who supplied Caribbean customers. On the paperwork, it was just whitefish, suitable for frying or baking. Nothing there said it would stand in for snapper in a stew, or that place would end up simmered with browning and Scotch bonnet. Officially, it was a neutral ingredient moving through the British cold chain. Caribbean fish did reach Britain, but in small and unreliable bursts. Dockside stalls in London or Liverpool might see a crate one week and none the next, while families in inland towns never saw them at all. So the version most people cooked settled around whatever the trawlers could land consistently. Fishmongers made quiet adjustments. They put aside bony pieces and heads for stewing, saved firmer chunks for customers who browned and braised them, and let others take neat fillets for fish and chips. Public talk of plenty of fish after rationing masked that swap, leaving brown stew fish built on cod and plaice from northern boats. 22. Pilau, Trinidad. What happens to pilau when pigeon peas almost never turn up? In one shared kitchen, the decision usually started with the cupboard. A single tin of pigeon peas might sit at the back, saved for Christmas or a christening, while 2 or 3 tins of kidney beans came from the local British grocer every payday. Pigeon peas cost more, needed a trip to a specialist shop, and depended on an importer actually having stock that week. Kidney beans were cheap, predictable, and already flowing through the same supply chains as baked beans and soup. So the everyday pilau in that house almost always began with a can opener on the red and white label, not the rare imported one. That one cupboard tells you how a whole dish shifted. Importers bringing pigeon peas into Britain focused on a few city hubs, so families living in smaller towns leaned even harder on what the local co-op or corner grocer could order through standard wholesalers. The method stayed the same: chicken browned, rice added, everything simmered together in one pot until it was ready. The cupboard door closed again, and the tin of pigeon peas went back on the top shelf untouched. 23. Sweet potato pudding, Jamaica. 1. Bruised sweet potato rolling to the front of a market stall could start the whole thing. In some cities, that mattered. It meant a rare chance to make proper pudding instead of yet another improvised cake with tinned carrots or pumpkin, or a plain sponge that never quite scratched the itch for something from home. People don't agree on how often those potatoes showed up. Some remember them as occasional but reliable on certain high streets. Others say you could search every stall for weeks and find only turnips and ordinary baking potatoes. Once you had them, the method was steady. Wash, peel, then grate on the fine side of a box grater until the bowl filled with damp shreds and your wrist hurt. Mix in flour, brown sugar, mixed spice, maybe a little rum, and stretch scarce coconut flavor with tinned cream, thinned out with water or evaporated milk. Instead of a Dutch pot with coals piled on top, the mixture went into rectangular tins and into gas ovens, baked until the center just set. And when no sweet potatoes arrived at all, some cooks grated white potatoes the same way and still put sweet potato pudding on the table. 24. Fried plantain, across the Caribbean. By the late 1950s, plantain was findable. Boxes came off lorries into small Caribbean shops around Brixton, Notting Hill, and parts of Birmingham, usually once a week at most. The fruit arrived hard and green, stacked in the back room until it softened enough to cook, and regulars learned which day to pass by so they didn't miss it. It wasn't cheap next to potatoes or onions, so people often bought just 2 or 3, wrapped in paper with the rest of the shopping. At home, someone sliced them on the slant, laid the pieces into a shallow pan, and turned them once, timing it between rice finishing and stew thickening. Those little shops were working off shipping links from Caribbean ports, slipping plantains into mixed cargo that also carried yams, seasonings, and tins of condensed milk, then moving them through wholesalers who understood there was a paying community for food the big chains ignored. Older migrants remember plantain as something they might only manage on weekends or for visitors, because wages were tight and the fruit could blacken before payday. Yet within a few years, frying plantain beside very British grilled bacon or sausages had become completely ordinary in many of those same houses. 25. Hot chocolate, cocoa tea, Jamaica, Trinidad. Grated cocoa stick hits hot water in an enamel mug. Someone stirs hard, watching the shavings melt down into a dark swirl. Sugar goes in next, then a splash of condensed milk, because fresh milk costs more and spoils faster in cramped lodgings. Powder works too, but the stick feels closer to home. Those sticks have already traveled more than most of the people using them. Cocoa leaves Trinidad or Jamaica as bulk export, gets processed, shipped on, and somehow ends up back in London or Birmingham as pressed sticks or tins on the shelves of small Caribbean groceries. Families stretch one stick across several mornings, shaving a little each time, turning it into something that makes cold council flats feel less hostile. Children drink theirs before school, adults hold onto their cups a bit longer. Back home, cocoa tea could be an everyday thing, yet here it edges towards a treat, even though the beans started life on the same estates many migrants grew up beside, which never quite adds up when looking at pay packets and grocery bills. Still, the habit sticks, a kettle boiling, a knife working along the side of a glossy brown cylinder, leaving a blunt, shortened piece ready for the next early start.